So, with no further ado, we'll pass to the next conference from Manon Schutz, which is called The Furniture That Shapes Our World, a Re-Examination of Tutankhamun's Bed, Chairs, and Thrones. About Manon Schutz have studied Egyptology at the University of Trier and Oxford and worked as lecturer at both these institutions. Since October 2022, she is employed as a teaching and research fellow in Wissenschaftlich Mitarbeiterinnen. I'm sorry for the misspelling, but my German is not the best. At the Institute of Egyptology and Coptology of the University of Münster. Her main interests are the categorization and meaning of furniture in ancient Egypt, and have written her PhD on beds in the funerary context. She didn't wrote it in a bed, she wrote about a bed. Well, it could work both ways, in fact. Now I'm thinking about that. So she also works on a project entitled Luxembourg and Egyptology, or Egyptology, an undertaking which tries to retrace the contact between Luxembourgish, I had a very bad addiction, citizens or people with a broader link to Luxembourg and Egypt. So with no further ado, Manon, please. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and just to elucidate that, a lot was written in bed as well. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to present parts of my research in this framework today. It is, of course, a great honor and also rather intimidating for me to speak beside such eminent scholars and connoisseurs of Tutankhamun. But I hope that my contribution on furniture categorization can still provide some food for thought. In my doctoral thesis with the title Sleep, Beds, and Death in Ancient Egypt, Studies on the Bed as a Female Entity, I have examined the use and symbolism of beds in the funerary context of ancient Egypt, from pre-dynastic to Roman times. Of course, my aim was never to analyze every single bed in existence, but to create a first overview of the topic and retrace potential developments and changes throughout these different periods. Now, one of the questions that arose during my research seemed very simple, namely, what actually is a bed? Although this question appears superfluous from our modern perspective, I mean, everyone here knows probably what a bed is and how it is used. Defining such an everyday, such a familiar object is not as easy as it appears at first. According to the Oxford Dictionary, to give but one example, a bed is a piece of furniture for sleeping in, so a rather basic definition. Here I show you the bed of Queen Hatepheres I from Dynasty IV, which looks quite similar to our modern counterparts. While this piece of furniture was found in the tomb, or what we generally interpret as the tomb of the queen at Giza, it is assumed that this object already served Hatepheres during her lifetime and was merely deposited in the tomb as burial equipment for use in her afterlife. Thus, the definition of the Oxford Dictionary seems to fit this ancient Egyptian bed, at least at first glance, a piece of furniture for sleeping in. However, one might now wonder whether beds are always actual pieces of furniture. What about the mattresses, mats or similar, upon which people sleep? Can they be regarded as pieces of furniture in a broader sense as well? Or do furniture items always need to have a compact frame made of wood, metal, plastic, or the like? Yet, mere mats and mattresses can still be used in the same way as furniture, in this case as beds, even without a frame. So what does constitute the core concept of bed? Is a bed only the frame and its accessories, so mattress, pillows, blankets, or is it actually the soft furnishings that truly make a bed a bed? The other point that was raised by the Oxford Dictionary definition is the bed's function as a sleeping place. Again, when we think about our own beds, we generally do not only use them for sleeping at night, but also, for instance, during sexual activities, birth, illnesses, death. We can likewise just sit upon them and read or watch a movie. In fact, the use of our beds can be quite individual. At the same time, these different contexts show that our beds are actually multi-purpose objects, even though the function as sleeping place often overshadows its other roles. And this multifunctionality also existed in Egypt. Unfortunately, I cannot go into any details here. In general, what I want to stress is that similarity in form does not automatically entail similarity in function. Thus, even though ancient Egyptian beds look similar to our own, they might still have a different function and overall meaning. Of course, this also means that similarity in function does not necessarily mean similarity in form, so that, for instance, mats and soft furnishing can be used and understood in the same way as wooden bedsteads. Overall, the definition of beds is not static, but varies from place to place, from period to period, and from person to person, and needs to be regularly defined, adapted, and changed. So in my work, my starting definition was that a bed is, well, a platform with or without legs that can accommodate a sleeping body, but can also be used for other activities like sitting. Moreover, this platform is seldom used on its own, but often in connection with other objects that are called accessories. Of course, this raises the question of how the bed has been defined and categorized within Egyptology. In the Egyptological literature, the terms bed, bier, and couch are used for pieces of reclining furniture that actually look very similar to each other, if not to say sometimes identical. In general, the designation bed is used for pieces of furniture in the everyday life, or what we generally define as the everyday life. In this case, that would be the bed here from the tomb of Merodach and Saqqara, or the bed I showed you before of Hatep I from Giza, so both dating to the Old Kingdom, as well as this bed from Merit that was found in her tomb in Deir Medina. Meanwhile, the term bier is used for objects with a purely funerary function. For instance, the bed depicted in the New Kingdom tomb of Sennacherib at Deir Medina. Lastly, the designation couch refers to the royal ritual specimens, like this Leonian bed from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And, I mean, to be honest, when you look at this example and the one I showed you of Sennacherib specimens, they do have a lot of similarity between them. And in Germany, or in the German language, you don't differentiate between the two by terminology. This is really an English thing. So this differentiation between the object is based on the lived experience and interpretation of the early Egyptologists working with this material, not on ancient Egyptian categorizations. Thus, for instance, the bier, as known by Carter and others, would have played an important role during the funerals of their times, and also later times, and also times before, but generally this is how it was used in Carter's period. So they carried the body of the deceased, mostly without the coffin, during ecclesiastical ceremonies in church and transporting the body afterwards to the tomb. Originally, biers were undecorated, uninscribed, and property of the deceased themselves. They did not have much value, so that they were deposited or actually disposed of in tombs. Over time, however, their decoration became more elaborate, as you can see here with this example from Tønder, Denmark. Now, the bier moved to the property of the church, so it was not disposed of anymore, but it was repeatedly reused for the burials of community members. Hence, the term bier has a very specific function and, as such, of course, very specific connotations. Of course, I'm not saying that such paraphernalia were and are only used by Christians, but this type of usage was most likely the one that influenced early Western Egyptologists at the time. So those Egyptologists that basically coined these terms that we are still using nowadays. No. On the other hand, in studies of the ancient world, the term couch, originating from the French se coucher, to lie down, is generally used to refer to Greco-Roman kline. So the piece of furniture upon which Greeks and Romans slept, but also sat and ate in this as well as the next life. And here I show you the example of the kline depicted in the Tigrane tomb in Alexandria. At the head end, you see a fulcrum, upon which the head of the deceased rests. The turned legs are likewise typical for this type of furniture. So, and we do find that in ancient Egypt, not just as depiction, but also as real objects. So, in this case, it is likely that the terminus couch was introduced to Egyptology via the so-called classical studies. But again, whether directly or indirectly, it carries specific connotations, specific expectations, specific ideas. So in short, the terms used in Egyptology for these pieces of furniture stem from a very particular context, a context that does not necessarily correspond to that of ancient Egypt. In fact, by applying our terms to these objects, we always transpose our own worldview onto them as well. After all, words are not neutral, but always convey certain connotations. Of course, and I want to stress this, I'm not saying that there are no points of contact between beds, biers, and couches in our modern sense. I just want to highlight that the usage of these different words in the context of ancient Egypt, without making ourselves aware of their actual origin and meaning, automatically and thus often unconsciously categorizes these object groups already. And sometimes, through terminology, we separate items from each other that actually belong together. For this reason, I decided to only use the designation bed in my own research, even though I am fully aware that it has its very own connotations and issues. I wanted to use a single term for this whole group of reclining furniture, independently of their context, so as to try and start my research with a more or less blank page. Now, after these rather theoretical considerations, I want to show you some concrete examples from Tutankhamun's tomb, which hopefully clarify what I mean. In the young king's tomb, 10 pieces of reclining furniture were found, which were classified by Carter and his team according to these three aforementioned groups. On the one hand, we have beds or bedsteads, so the objects that the pharaoh likely used during his lifetime, maybe during different periods of his life, in different places, maybe in different palaces. Elements that generally hint at an everyday life use are the presence of real webbing made of plant fiber, occasionally leather that acted like springs and offered more comfort to the person sleeping or sitting atop. Moreover, elaborate decoration like animal heads and tails are usually absent in these instances. A subcategory of these beds is the folding bedstead, also referred to as travel bed, which the king would have used also during his lifetime, but this time during his travels, so it could be folded up, as you can see here, and would thus have been more easily transportable. The second group of reclining furniture identified by Carter is the bier. This piece of furniture stood inside the king's stone sarcophagus and carried the three anthropomorphic coffins of the king. The outer form is fit for the object's purpose, so the legs are rather short and sturdy, since they had to support the massive weight of the coffins. In the picture here, you can clearly see how the heaviness has literally weighed down the bed over the millennia, actually. Sorry. You can see here how it was bent to the inside, and also the legs were spread outside due to the weight. As this piece had a purely funerary function, its webbing was merely carved into the platform. After all, comfort at this stage was not of essence here. The presence of the leonine heads is likewise remarkable, as well as that of the tails wrapped around the animal's rear legs. And the same can be said about the third and probably best known category of reclining furniture from the tomb, namely the so-called couches. And here you see the Taweret Amit one. Overall, the king was buried with three such long-legged exemplars, so with three couches, namely a Taweret Amit one, a lioness, and a cow-shaped one that were placed along the west wall of the antechamber, looking towards the north and hence towards the burial chamber and the body of the king that was placed there. Their long, thin legs indicate that the mummy, and only the mummy, was placed on their backs. The priests being able also to move on the mummy during that time without bending their backs. I mean, it would have been impractical if they would have had shorter legs. The role of Taweret Amit was to swallow the aging son and by extension the king himself, marking the beginning of the regeneration process. The following leonine bed represents the actual transition and transformation of the deceased, and this is also the reason why this type is the most frequently attested, being the true emblem of the rebirth journey, and as such is also linked actually to the solar bark. But again, I can't go into details here. Eventually, the bovine bat representative of Mehed Weret gives birth to the deceased again and elevates them to the sky. And here it should briefly be mentioned that the leonine and the bovine bats were swapped in Tutankhamun's tomb, so they stood in the wrong place, as evidenced by other occurrences of these three bats. Now, I would like to briefly step back and return to the short-legged leonine bat. Should this exemplar, so the beer, actually be seen as part of the couches, or are they really completely separate as suggested by the terminology? A hint that this might indeed be the case, that it actually belonged to the same group, is found in the tomb of Seti I from Dynasty 19. In a room that lies adjacent to the burial chamber, 2 rows with 4 ritual beds are represented. Unfortunately, as you can see here, the reliefs are in rather poor state of preservation nowadays. But I think it's still visible, it's still recognizable for my purpose. So each group starts with a Taweret Amit bed, and you can see the 2 of them here, followed by a leonine bed and a bovine bed. So we have the same 3 beds that we have already seen in the tomb of Tutankhamun. But here we have a second leonine bed that follows this row. So how does this fit into the overall understanding of these beds? Could this 4th bed actually correspond to Tutankhamun's short-legged leonine specimen, so to his bier? When shown in relief, there was no need to differentiate between the beds and adapt them to their practical function. It does not matter how much weight they would have needed to carry, or that they would have been needed to be higher to ease the priest's work. So the actuality, the reality, just didn't matter in this case. So there are good reasons to connect both bed groups, so bier and couches. In fact, I believe that this short-legged exemplar represents a past pro toto of the whole group. So an abbreviation, as well as the cyclical continuation, so the eternalization of this rebirth process, because the end is not to be reborn once, but the reason, the function of this is to be reborn every day, just like the sun. So this would also explain why only leonine beds were found in non-royal tombs. It truly symbolizes this idea of rebirth journey. Although this is just one example, I think that it clearly shows that the boundaries between the furniture categories that we ourselves created, so beds, biers, and couches, are rather blurry and actually flexible, if not to say artificial. Now I want to go a step further and present some preliminary thoughts on chairs and thrones. When it comes to seating furniture, we encounter similar issues than those with the beds. Namely, questions like, what is a chair and what is a throne? Can we really distinguish between the two, and if so, how? According to Carter's object cards, there was only one throne or ceremonial chair in Tutankhamun's tomb, namely the well-known gold throne that we have seen already before. The other pieces of seating furniture are addressed as mere chairs and stools. For instance, this child's chair, or this so-called fold stool, also known as ecclesiastical throne. The term fold stool, just to give an example, actually refers to the chair that developed from the sella curulis of the Roman magistrates and is nowadays used by bishops when officiating outside their own church or cathedral. So again, the term suggests a very specific context and connotation. Yet while the terms used for beds still follow Carter's categorization, at least more or less, this is not the case for the seating furniture. So again, this fold stool can be addressed as throne or ceremonial chair in the Egyptological literature as well. I think this example already shows the issue of our modern terminology and the definite need for systematic study. But let us talk a bit about chairs and their development in ancient Egypt. Interestingly, beds are older than chairs and were likely used as seating opportunities right from the start. Moreover, in pre- and early dynastic times, beds could be quite short. In fact, just long enough to accommodate a body sleeping in a fetal position, and hence blur the boundaries between the 2 types of furniture. Yet with the occurrence of actual chairs, beds were still used as sitting opportunities, as seen, for instance, in this Old Kingdom relief from Meroruka's tomb dating to Dynasty 6. Although this scene with a harp-playing wife certainly has erotic connotations, and it has always been interpreted like that, I still think that we can and should read it on a more basic level first, namely as the bed being a focal point for social interactions of whatever kind, like entertainment, discussions, and business. Furthermore, what also connects beds and chairs is the ability to raise their owners literally above everyone else, and thus to highlight their elevated status. The beds are a pure status symbol, just like thrones as well. So, such a link between the two apparently separate object categories is not only visible in paintings and reliefs, but also tangible through the term set, for instance, which can refer to seats and thrones, so seating furniture in general, but also beds. This close connection remains palpable throughout all the periods until the Greco-Roman times. Actually, at that late period, these connections, they intensify, and we find even more terms referring either to beds or to chairs. And in translations, we usually choose the term that we consider is the best fit. But did the ancient Egyptians really make this same distinction as we do? Or could bed and chair, in particular throne, be closer related to each other than our modern thinking would suggest? At least in other cultures, this association is well known. Here, I can only give you a few examples. For instance, this garden relief in which Ashurbanipal, that you can see here, is lying on a bed, on a sort of cleaner, while his wife sits atop a throne. There's no doubt that his own authority is higher than that of the queen, even though that he's lying down. Another more recent example here in the middle is the bed throne of the Ethiopian empress, seen here in the picture with Empress Sauditu. Also, the throne of the Persian Shah has clear associations with a bed, again blurring these lines between the two object categories. Of course, I'm not saying that the ancient Egyptians would not have made any difference between beds and thrones, just that the beds should be seen through a different lens than we do nowadays. After all, even in Europe, the bed was a status symbol and expression of the highest authority until fairly recently. Thus, if beds and thrones are connected in form, one might wonder whether their function and meaning could be related as well. As seen, beds are intrinsically linked with the solar cycle and the daily rebirth process of the deceased in the funerary context. Now, could the Egyptian throne maybe have a similar function in the context of kingship as well? For instance, the lions on the throne of Khafre's statue might likewise be related to this symbolism, representing the renewal of the king and his power on a daily basis, just like that of the sun. If so, this interpretation might be extended to the royal women that can take the place of these lions in some cases, as seen here in the example of the Manon colossi. Thus, the presence of these royal mothers, wives, and daughters would not just be a means of including them into the family portrait. In fact, they would play a rather active role in the cyclical regeneration and strengthening of royal power. Of course, these are, as mentioned, just preliminary thoughts on furniture categorization more generally that have emerged from my doctoral thesis. But I hope to further investigate chairs and thrones in the future. And on this note, we have reached the end of my talk today. I hope I was able to show you that there can be quite some differences between our modern worldview, represented by Carter's furniture categorization, and that of the ancient Egyptians, especially when it comes to such common and familiar objects like beds and chairs. As we apparently know these terms and their use very well, there being some visual similarities with their modern counterparts, we apply our terms and indirectly connotations onto the ancient Egyptian objects, often obfuscating their original function and meaning. Of course, in a way, we will never be able to completely let go of our own experiences as well as our own view and understanding of the world. But I think that it is important to constantly make ourselves aware of our own biases, to challenge ourselves in this regard. We need to be conscious of which words we use in what context, as words are never neutral. After all, we comprehend the world around us through words. Words create and words bring into existence, as already the ancient Egyptians knew. And we can only try our best to come closer to ancient Egypt, one word at a time. And after so many, maybe too many words from my side, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Manon, for such an interesting presentation. I'm sure many questions will be raised. Now,